Hello class. By now you've completed the modules on learning, and that's modules 20, 21, and 22, focusing on classical conditioning and operant conditioning and other forms of learning. My take-home points are going to focus on classical and operant conditioning, trying to ensure that concepts associated with those forms of learning are clear. One of the first take-home points that I want to make sure I'm clear on is the difference between elicited versus emitted responses. Classical conditioning focuses on elicited responses, while operant focuses on emitted responses. An elicited response is one envisioned that is pulled from the subject. So, when Pavlov was working with his dogs, the unconditioned stimulus would be food, and the unconditioned response that was elicited, or a reflexive kind of response that was pulled from the dogs, was salivation. Another example, if there is a very loud noise behind you, that would be the unconditioned stimulus, that would elicit, bring out, kind of pull out a startled response and a reflexive response. Okay? So the elicited is also, at least in classical conditioning, is a reflexive response, a simplistic response. As far as operant conditioning and Skinner focused on the emitted responses. So think of responses that the organism, the rat that Skinner worked with, or humans, that organisms initiate. They get the ball rolling. Okay? So when you talk about studying for an exam, that's an emitted response. That's something that you have to get the ball rolling on. When you talk about seeking out employment, again, that's an emitted response. You have to get the ball rolling on that. So elicited responses are really passive responses. They're pulled from the organism, while emitted responses are active responses. Okay? So we initiate those responses. So that's one take-home point. Another take-home point is that the principles of classical conditioning, things like acquisition, generalization, discrimination, extinction, spontaneous recovery, those principles of classical conditioning also apply to operant conditioning in a little different way, but the base definition is the same. So if extinction is the weakening of a response as applied to classical conditioning, or the weakening of an association, really is a better way to think of extinction. In classical conditioning, the association is made between the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. So extinction occurs when the association between the CS and the US is weakened. If you present the CS alone without the US, then you'll have extinction. In operant conditioning, extinction is still the weakening of an association, but in this case, the association is behavior and consequences. So engaging in a certain behavior and receiving a certain outcome. Okay? Extinction is going to occur when that association becomes weaker and weaker. So you have, for instance, an organism engaging in a given behavior for an outcome, but you no longer give that outcome, extinction will occur. Okay? So again, the principles apply to both, but in slightly different ways. The base definition is the same of all those principles. So keep that in mind when you're studying those principles. Going to operant conditioning a little more specifically, as far as operant conditioning, one of the things that I want to make sure is clear is reinforcement versus punishment and positive versus negative, focusing on the outcomes of the behavior. So potential outcomes: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. Envision breaking the outcomes down into positive or negative, put those concepts to the side, to one side, and then reinforcement versus punishment to another side. So starting with reinforcement versus punishment. If something is reinforcing, it'll increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring again. Okay? So if you get paid for doing something, you're likely to do that something again because the payment is reinforcement. So reinforcement will increase. Punishment will decrease the frequency of a response. So if you get punished, if you get insulted for engaging in a certain behavior, then you're less likely to engage in that behavior that led to the insult again. Okay? So punishment decreases. So remember that. Reinforcement increase, punishment decrease. For positive versus negative, Positive doesn't mean good. What it means is addition of something. You're adding something to the situation. Negative means taking something away, subtracting from the situation. So if you receive money, money is added. Okay? If your driver's license is taken away, your driver's license is subtracted. Okay? So envision again that addition or subtraction of something. Also, please remember that negative doesn't mean bad. It just means subtraction of something. So putting the two together, positive, getting something, reinforcement, increased frequency. Money is added, you're paid. You're likely to work again to get that money. Okay? Negative reinforcement. Something is subtracted, and you're going to work to have that thing subtracted again. Example, you have a headache, you take aspirin, the headache is subtracted, okay, and you're glad it's gone, so you're going to take an aspirin again if you have a headache again. Okay? So negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment. We like negative reinforcement because an annoying stimulus is removed, and we're happy that it's gone. Okay? So as far as punishment, positive punishment, getting something that you don't like. Okay, so a child getting a spanking would be positive punishment. You getting insulted would be positive punishment. Negative punishment. In this case, you got subtraction of something that's the negative, and we're unhappy about it. Or we're unhappy that it's gone. Okay? So in this case, as far as a driver's license being taken away, that's negative punishment. Okay? Because we want our license, because that gives us freedom. We can go places that we want to go. Okay? So again, reinforcement, increased behavior, punishment, decreased behavior, positive adding something, negative subtracting something, then put the two together to determine the outcome. Okay? So one or two, make sure that that was clear. Okay? As far as the schedules of reinforcement, that's also something in operant conditioning. And here's another area where I'm going to say separate. Okay? So think of, first, fixed versus variable, put that on one side, and then interval versus ratio, put that on the other side. Fixed means the same, going to be constant, variable switching up. Interval means time. You have to wait a certain amount of time. Ratio means your behavior is important. You have to do something. Okay? So for instance, putting the two together, fixed interval. Have to wait the same amount of time for something to occur. It's always going to be the same amount of time. So for instance, if you're paid every 2 weeks, that's a fixed interval. Your birthday every year, fixed interval. Okay? As far as a variable interval, time is still important, but the time you have to wait changes. So think of texting somebody and getting a reply back. Sometimes you have to wait 5 minutes, sometimes only 2 seconds. Okay? But the idea is you have to wait. It doesn't matter if you text them over and over and over, you just got to wait for their response. And the amount of time you have to wait changes, variable interval. As far as ratio, that's where the number of behaviors that you engage in makes a difference. Okay? So a fixed ratio would mean that you have to engage in a behavior a certain amount of time to receive the outcome. So a child has to make their bed 5 times before they get a quarter or $1. It will be cheap. Okay? But they have to do it 5 times, no more, no less. Okay? And then they'll get that money. Okay? So fixed ratio. Variable ratio, your behavior still matters, okay, but the number of behaviors you have to engage in changes. That's the variable component of it. So in this case for the child, sometimes they get paid every 3 times after cleaning their room, sometimes it's every 5 times, sometimes it's every 10 times. So they have to engage in the behavior, they just don't know how often they have to do it before getting the reinforcement. Okay, so that's variable ratio. If they just sat around and did nothing, didn't clean up their room, they're not going to get the reinforcement, so they have to do something. Okay? So those are schedules of reinforcement. Okay? Something else to consider with the schedules is resistance to extinction and basically quick acquisition. Okay? The quickest acquisition or learning occurs with the continuous schedule. This is where the organism is reinforced after every response. Okay, so this is every time the child makes their bed, they get that reinforcement. So they're going to really catch on quick. I do this, I get this outcome. Okay? As far as the most resistance to extinction, that's going to be your variable schedules. So the idea is that because the organism doesn't know exactly when to expect the reinforcement, they keep on plugging away. They keep on trying to get that reinforcement. Okay? So those are some of the other effects of reinforcement. And then finally, this is a long take-home point video, last one. When you think about modeling or observational learning, something that I want you to consider here is, yes, we're watching others, we're learning others' behavior, but note, we're not only observing others, we're looking at the outcome they receive. Okay? So we're looking at whether they get reinforcement or punishment. If another person gets reinforced for a behavior, we're likely to imitate that behavior. If a person gets punished for a behavior, what happens is we're not likely to imitate, but we still learn something. We learn, don't do that, because I'll get punished. Okay? So those are my take-home points for the learning chapter. Sorry, this one is longer, and I will see you in the next